So in this video, I'll be sharing with you some new information regarding one of the more popular alternative suspects concerning the murders of Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. Firstly, I'll be taking you through the police statement given by Kevin Tarbuck just 8 days after these murders, and then I'll take you through the evidence Kevin Tarbuck gave at the Old Bailey during the trial of Jack Wombs and Michael Steele. Take a listen to the following. The following police statement is given by Kevin Tarbuck, dated the 14th of December 1995. I work for Sutcliffe Industrial Services Limited, who at present have a contract at Hanningfield Water Treatment Works. When I finish work, I leave the site and turn right onto the A130 towards Southend. I've been working on that site for about 5 weeks and have travelled along that road every evening during that period. At about 1940 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December 95, I finished work and started my journey home. As I approached Rettendon along the A130, I had just passed White House Farm on the left hand side and was approaching a small lane, again on the left hand side. As I got nearer to the lane, a white Ford Escort van emerged from the lane and turned left towards Rettendon in front of me. I only saw that it had one male person in it who was driving. The reason I remember this is that in pulling out in front of me, it caused me to brake, and because it was icy and snowing, I thought what an idiot he was. The vehicle then accelerated away from me. I followed, but by the time I had reached the Rettendon Turnpike roundabout, the van was nowhere to be seen. I would think the van was a D or E reg due to the style of the vehicle. I would not be able to identify the driver again. I would estimate the time that this happened would be about 1950 hours. At the time of the incident, it was dark and snowing. I had my windscreen wipers on and my headlights. In spite of these conditions, visibility was fairly good. There was no other vehicle immediately in front or behind me. If the van had waited for me to pass, he could have pulled out without affecting anybody. The vehicle was in my sight for about 15 seconds, and the nearest I was to it was about 30 yards. Okay, now this is one of the more talked about statements, one of the more talked about eyewitness accounts concerning the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, because many people hear this, or many people read this statement, and their immediate thought is, well, hang on a minute, could this actually be the killer of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe? Bearing in mind, the lane where this vehicle is seen coming from, where it pulls out from, actually leads to where the Range Rover would then later be discovered. We're told that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were killed just before 7 o'clock. This eyewitness account originates just before 8. So there's certain parallels there. But most importantly, it's the behaviour of the driver, isn't it? He doesn't wait for Kevin Tarbuck to pass. He almost comes out onto the edge of the lane and pulls out straight in front of oncoming traffic. Interestingly, there was no car in front of Kevin Tarbuck, no car behind. So if the guy driving the escort van had just waited for maybe 5 or 10 seconds, he could have pulled out without affecting anyone. So it's almost as if you get the impression, don't you, that this guy is in a rush. He's nervous potentially, possibly a little bit shaken up. He's not thinking straight. He pulls out onto the main road, floors the van, and then by the time they get to the Rettendon Turnpike, the van has disappeared. But it's not only the behaviour of the driver which is actually quite interesting. It's the parallels that this particular statement, the parallels that this story shares with Darren Nichols. Darren Nichols' version of events for the evening of December the 6th is that he was the actual getaway driver. He was driving not an escort van, but a beige-coloured Volkswagen Passat estate. He drops Jack Wombs off in the lane. Jack gets out of the vehicle. He grabs a plumber's bag and a coat. Darren Nichols makes his way back onto the main road, takes the next left up to Meadow Road and waits for a phone call. Jack then calls Darren, come and pick us up. Darren pulls back onto the main road and back down the lane. Darren is sitting there in the dark waiting for Mick and Jack to turn up. And then all of a sudden the back door opens and Jack gets in. Darren Nichols takes a glance in the rearview mirror and Jack is covered in blood. At this point, Darren claims to not really know what's going on. He's quite shaken up. He's quite confused about what's happening. Mick then gets into the front of the vehicle and tells Darren to get going. So let's just listen to the parallels of this story combined with the statement of Kevin Tarbuck. These are Darren Nichols' own words. Mick told me to get going, and though my mind was elsewhere, my body somehow obeyed, putting the car into gear and moving off towards the main road. From then on, everything happened in slow motion. I saw the headlights, heard the screech of tyres, and braced myself for impact. But it never came. Mick had grabbed the steering wheel at the last moment and wrenched it to one side, avoiding a crash by just a few inches. The other driver flashed his lights and swore at me out of his half-open window. I just pulled out onto the main road without looking, but I honestly didn't know where I was or what I was doing. I just sat there like a zombie. So it's almost as if you're being told the same story, but involving two different vehicles, isn't it? One is the escort van described by Kevin Tarbuck. The other vehicle, according to Darren Nichols, is the beige Volkswagen Passat estate. But interestingly, when the police recovered that vehicle, the beige VW Passat estate, when they recovered that vehicle, there was nothing evidentially speaking to tie that particular car to the crime scene. There was no gunpowder residue. There was no blood. There was no DNA. There was no hair fibres. There were no hair fibres. There was nothing evidentially speaking to connect that particular vehicle as the getaway car. But let's take a listen to Kevin Tarbuck's appearance at the Old Bailey. This was something that I've only just become aware of. This is new information to myself. But the judge, during his summing up, goes into a bit more detail regarding Kevin Tarbuck's evidence. Take a listen to the following. So the following is from the judge's summing up of the case, where he states the following. Kevin Tarbuck was seen by police officers on the 14th of December in connection with the murders 8 days before. He was working at Hanningfield near the reservoir. When he had finished, he had come out and turned right onto the A130 and right towards Rettendon on the A127. Before that night, he had travelled that road every evening except for weekends, and on the 6th of December, he was driving a Ford Sierra. He left his work at approximately 7:50, not earlier than 7:45 or later than 8. Approaching Rettendon, he neared White House Farm, which he is familiar with. He was not aware of any turning just past White House Farm, but it became familiar on that occasion. It was on his left as he was going towards the turnpike. There were no cars in front or behind him on the road. It was very dark and he had his lights on at full beam. A white Ford Escort van pulled out in front of him and caused him to brake. He pulled out and turned left towards Rettendon in front of him. He did not see if it stopped. He just remembered seeing it pull straight out in front of him. He braked quite sharply and flashed his lights, as well as making what he called an obscene gesture. He got about 30 yards from the car in front and was not right behind it. He could not make out the occupant or occupants. They were only silhouettes. He could not say who was inside, but obviously one person was driving. The driver was accelerating. He got as far as the turnpike and the car in front had disappeared. He said, quote, "My previous occupation was a tyre and exhaust fitter. I'm in no doubt it was a white Escort van. I'd say the approximate time was 5 to 8. It was in my sight for about 30 seconds. I was interviewed the very next day on the 7th, and arrangements were made for me to make a statement." Cross-examined by Mr. Lederman, he said his work did not have set hours. He made his statement about a week later, the following Thursday. He agreed his statement started with the words, "At about 7:40 I finished work." He said it was later than 7:40 he started his journey. When he spoke according to the police, they said someone will come round, and someone did come round about a week later. Cross-examined by Mr. Parkins, he said, "As far as I know, it happened at about 7:50. I was working at the West Hanningfield Reservoir. It was about a quarter of a mile to the main road. So far as I could see, it was just a driver in the car. I could only see someone on the driver's side. There may have been someone else in the car, but I didn't see anybody." He looked at photograph 2 and accepted there was a track parallel with the road coming from White House Farm, as well as Workhouse Lane itself. He was not aware of that track until now. He did not see the vehicle in the track or on the lane. All he saw was a van moving in front of him. Re-examined, he said there were 2 separate windows in the back of the van. He was asked by the CID later, who asked me what happened and asked me if I saw a white Passat. It was definitely not a white Passat. The time was just before 8 o'clock. Wow, I literally can't believe that. As I'm narrating that, that's the very first time that I've heard the police be aware of a VW Passat. A VW Passat colour white. Now, interestingly here, it doesn't mention, does it, that Kevin Tarbuck was interviewed on a number of occasions, or we called him back a couple of months later. This appears to be information that they already have, that the police already have, 8 days after the murders. They're looking for a white Passat. I can't believe that. That's literally, out of all the years I've done this, this is the first time that I've seen the police be aware of the vehicle that Nichols claims he was driving, a beige-coloured, cream-coloured, beige-coloured Volkswagen Passat estate. He was asked by the CID later, who asked me what happened and asked me if I saw a white Passat. It was definitely not a white Passat. Now, all we can take from that is that this guy was interviewed 8 days after the murders. He was interviewed on the 14th of December. You can only take it from that that conversation must have happened during that interview. So the police were looking for a white-coloured Passat as early as 8 days after the murders. Yet we've never seen a statement. We've never seen a single statement from anyone who claims to have seen that white vehicle. Maybe there is one. Maybe one does actually exist, but we haven't seen it. I can't believe that. That is mad. That's crazy. So just to try and recap what I've said there, what's interesting about this is that we're told that, Darren Nichols gets arrested some months later. He turns out to be driving a beige-coloured Volkswagen estate. But the police appear to be onto this vehicle, or at least looking for a similar vehicle, 8 days after the murders, which tells me they've got some kind of information. Someone's come forward and said, yeah, I saw a Passat pulling into the lane, or I saw a Passat driving nearby, or I saw a Passat driving in a strange manner. There's something about a white Passat that's been passed on to the police, and this individual has been asked about it. Are you sure it wasn't a white Passat? Because they've already had information, haven't they? 8 days after the murders. I wonder who gave that statement. I've never seen that before. Never seen that before. Anyway, I'll make a separate video on this because it's actually really important. But let's get back to what we were talking about, the escort van. Now, the story of Kevin Tarbuck, it starts to fall apart when they bring up the photograph or the aerial photograph of White House Farm. Because what you'll notice here is that there's a lane that goes parallel from the farm to the start of Workhouse Lane. And Kevin Tarbuck wasn't aware that that lane existed. Now, I actually believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm fairly confident that the farmers, when they discovered Tucker, Tate and Rolfe on the morning of December the 7th, they actually took that very same lane. They didn't go onto the main road and then to the start of Workhouse Lane. They simply took that track to the sort of top of Workhouse Lane and then turned down. That gate there isn't always locked. And if that's a farm vehicle, let's just say it's the farmer's escort van, for argument's sake, or someone to do with the farm, it may well be that they've just travelled along that track parallel with the road. They've got to the end of Workhouse Lane and turned out onto the road without looking. Kevin Tarbuck wasn't aware that that lane existed. And think about this also from a logical perspective. If Kevin Tarbuck says there was no car in front of me, there was no car behind, is it feasible that someone's travelling along that track parallel, they're sort of looking out to their right, looking to see if there's anything coming, and they simply pull out from the lane without really paying attention? They think the road's clear, there's no lights, there's no headlights here, let's just pull out. They've done this 100 times, 1,000 times, whatever, and they've just pulled out in a careless way. Is that possible? Kevin Tarbuck also states he doesn't see the vehicle come out of the lane. It doesn't emanate from that lane, does it? He says the only thing he remembers is the van being in front of him. But that track's quite interesting. Could it have been someone who just simply pulled into Workhouse Lane, turned around? Is it a vehicle to do with the farm? Is it a vehicle that was visiting and it's simply come along that parallel track? It's got to the gate. On that occasion, the gate's open. He's simply come round, had a quick look. And what he hasn't realised is that Kevin Tarbuck's actually coming round the corner and he's pulled out accidentally. Is that possible? I mean, it doesn't even seem, does it really, looking at the summing up, that Kevin Tarbuck's exactly sure where he saw it. He said, excuse me, he said it was a lane on the left-hand side, or it appeared from the left-hand side before the turnpike. It's not very exact. And I think that that's how the prosecution have been able to put an element of doubt here in the jury's mind. They're basically saying you don't really know when you finished work, you're not really sure what time this happened, and you're also not aware that there's a lane that runs parallel alongside the road and connects up there to Workhouse Lane. So there's nothing to say that this van actually went anywhere near the Range Rover. But it is a little bit crazy to think, isn't it? If that is the lane where that escort van came from, just how close that was to the bodies being discovered a lot earlier, where the scene could have been preserved in a quicker manner. They wouldn't have lost so much evidence. It could have been found an hour after they were killed. If this guy had just gone down Workhouse Lane to the bottom, he most likely would have found the Range Rover. It's really eerie to think, isn't it, that someone was that close to discovering the bodies just an hour after they were murdered. Now, the final piece of the puzzle concerning the white escort van comes from the LWT Crime Monthly programme. Now, this was on TV back on December the 22nd, 1995. So we've got Kevin Tarbuck. He speaks to police on the 14th of December. And this show is on TV on the 22nd. Now, is it just a pure coincidence here as to what vehicle is following the Range Rover? I'm not going to spoil it for you. You probably know what it is already, but I'll show you this in a short moment. Or is this some kind of Easter egg chucked in here by the police, hoping to jog someone's memory? Or is this just a pure coincidence? Take a look at the following video. Now, I'm sure many people would have seen that before and they would have said, oh yeah, there's a white van behind the Range Rover. I'd never noticed that until I'd taken a bit more notice of this particular police statement. I'd never noticed until I went back and just happened to somehow come across this video at the same time I was making this particular video and noticed the Range Rover was being followed by a Ford Escort van, colour white. Was that put in there for this reconstruction in order to jog someone's memory? Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Now, my thoughts on this in its entirety is that this statement by Kevin Tarbuck is incredibly interesting, but it could be easily explained at the same time. We've got that parallel track that runs along the A127. There's every possibility here that this white van never came into contact with the Range Rover. And that in itself is quite an eerie thought, isn't it? That the Range Rover could have been discovered a lot earlier than it actually was. It could have been discovered as early as an hour after this crime had been committed, if that vehicle had gone down to the bottom of Workhouse Lane. But let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Do you believe that this vehicle is connected? Do you believe that it has absolutely nothing to do with this crime? It was just a chance encounter, and quite possibly the van never actually went to the bottom of Workhouse Lane in the first place. What I've always found interesting, though, is remember what Darren Nichols states. The way that he drives out of the lane, he cuts someone up, he pulls out in front of someone, this guy pulls down, winds down his window, sticks his fingers up at him. It's very similar, isn't it? It shares very many parallels with the story given by Kevin Tarbuck. And I've always thought to myself, what sort of vehicle would an electrician drive? Darren Nichols was an electrician at the time. Would it be beyond the realms of possibility that Darren Nichols drove a Ford Escort van? Is that possible? Let me know some of your thoughts down in the comment section below.